So we're going to switch off our cameras and give the floor to Yao. We'll switch off the video so that it's lighter for everybody. And the floor goes to Yao Agbetse. He's the coordinator for advocacy at BICE, and he will talk to us about the rights approach in our actions in favor of the rights of the child. How can we push forward this rights approach so that it is not just activism, goodwill, but to have good arguments with authorities and our partners in order to push forward the cause for children. Let's all switch off our microphones and the floor goes to Yao. Thank you, Marie-Laure. Thank you, Camila, for the introduction for our partners in Latin America. Thank you, Marie-Laure, with regard to the French speakers in Africa. Thank you, Diana, for her message given to our English-speaking partners. It is a pleasure for me to begin this series of online formation with you. I am thankful to all of you because I know that some people have stayed up quite late, other people have gotten up quite early, and some people are in different time zones. Therefore, I'm saying good morning, good evening, based on your place of residence. It's a true pleasure for me, even an honor, to be able to address you about this topic that is so important. Marie-Laure, in her introduction, touched on an essential element. We just don't do the work we do as an organization in civil society just because of our goodwill. There are approaches, there's a framework, there's a dynamic, there's a mechanism, some elements that need to be implemented so that the activities we carry out can relate to everything that is provided for as dispositions with regard to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Why should we have a rights approach? It is truly important, and I can assure that the UN, it is a requirement. For example, the World Health Organization has an approach based on health. For instance, UNESCO has an approach based on education. Take other organizations such as the Program for the UN for Development has a right-based approach. It is an important element that allows us to feed and carry out all our activities, be that activities carried out by the states or state organizations or the civil society organizations such as us. What do we talk about when we talk about an approach based on rights? What is it about? Allow me to start with a definition. With regard to the human rights, the rights approach relates to the adoption and implementation of laws, programs, methods, but also tools and practices that are adjusted, but especially focused on the child considered as a subject and a bearer of rights. This is important because the rights approach allows us to have a framework for the analysis, to have a framework for planning, for implementation, and for the follow-up of the activities established by the state or by civil society organizations. So the rights approach is based on the obligations of the state with regard to children, the plural needs of the child. I will define this later, these complementary rights and the capability for resilience. The rights approach is a state of mind. This state of mind should inhabit all the activities that we carry out as a civil society organization, but especially when we do monitoring of the state actions, we also should have this spirit. It's also a holistic approach, that is, it embraces a number of complementary elements which ensure that the compliance, the synergy of these elements allow us to reach an objective and precisely ensure the best interest of the child, and something that I will relate to during my presentation. When we talk about the rights approach, there is a prevention element, a protection element, and the rehabilitation of the child. And how is this done? We must consider the state on the one hand, but also the child on the other hand. The state has to act based on the rights in order to make the contractual obligations effective, be that from a legal perspective or international perspective, the state must act. It is an obligation and not an option. It is an obligation of the state to satisfy, to allow a child who's a victim of violence to gain access to adequate services. Before being a victim, he has to be protected. So there's a system of prevention. That's why I was talking about prevention, protection, rehabilitation of the child. So the state must act. It's an obligation. It's not an option for the state, and the state must adopt within this framework of rights a complementary practice. And this refers us back to what we call indivisibility and complementarity of rights. For example, the right to education without the right to health is incomplete. Imagine children going to school, but who cannot gain access to health services. It would be incomplete. Another example is the listening without a suggested holistic accompaniment. It's incomplete. When you listen to a child without offering some accompaniment or responsibility, you're no longer in the rights approach. On the part of the child is considered as a subject of right for a long time, including in Western countries. For a long time, the child was not a subject of right. The child was there with no right to speak. Everything was done. But there's a change of paradigm with the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Now, the child is a subject of right. He's a bearer and a subject of right. Therefore, the child benefits from rights. It's not charity when the state engages in actions for the satisfaction of the child. It's not about charity. These are rights to be executed. A treatment based on rights is also a social approach. What is useful when we talk about the rights approach, it goes beyond the social approach. I will come back to this. What is it about? Well, you all know the different dispositions of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, so I will not go back on those details as provided by the Convention on the Rights of the Child. However, when we talk about a rights-based approach, we speak of rights and needs. If there's a comparison, what's the analysis we perform? We must know that we have to make the rights of the child valid instead of satisfying the needs. This is a fundamental element in this rights approach. Needs can be over or be considered as exhausted when the rights are inherent to the person. For example, when a child is in a refugee camp, for example, he needs humanitarian rights, but when the conflict is supposedly over, we consider that those needs no longer exist. But the enjoyment of the rights is connected to the person and not the situation in which this person is at a given time. The rights approach is based on the place that we give to the child. The place of the child is at the center. When we speak of the needs-based approach, we cannot implement an approach that is articulated around a situation that is experienced at a given time. There is an opposition between a lasting approach as compared to a timely approach that depends on a specific situation or need of the child. So how can we put everything I said in a form of action. How do we articulate this so that it can give concrete effects in the life of the child? We have to start, we begin by the analysis I was mentioning. The analysis, we should begin by the international obligations that the state has contracted. And these are in the legal instruments ratified by the state. In Latin America, these are the instruments at the level of the American states. In Europe, it is all the tools adopted by either the European Council, but also by the European Union, that is all the states in Europe. Or if you're in Asia, that's the ASEAN, for instance, that adopts a series of tools in Africa. It's at the level of the African Union, the African Charter, and specifically with regards to the Charter for the Welfare and Rights of the Child in Africa. So we need to ratify preferably without reserves. If you want to discuss the reservations, I'm available. So ratify without reservations. What does it mean? It requires integration of this rights approach, harmonization of the national right with regard to regional and international obligations contracted. It also means that the state that is ratifying must have the tools for the surveillance of the implementation of this approach in its own legal system. At the international level, we have, of course, the Convention on the Rights of the Child that today has universal ratification, that is that all the states have ratified this this convention, except the US, who have signed it but not ratified. They have not ratified the operational protocols. So when we talk about the conventional block at the international level, that is the Convention on the Rights of the Child, it's the optional protocol concerning the involvement of children in armed conflicts, but also the third one concerning the procedure for communication at the regional level. In Africa, it's the Charter for the Rights and Welfare of Children. In Latin America, we have the Inter-American Human Rights Convention with all the discussions specifically referred to children. In Asia, there's other documents. In Europe, since we speak about violence, we can refer to the Lanzarote Convention. Ratifying is fine, but harmonizing the national law is even better. This consists in adopting the national texts consistently with regional rights or international rights ratified. We need to respect the calendar of submission in regional mechanisms for supervision. We, for instance, have the Committee on the Rights of the Child that does the monitoring of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. You certainly know this. You must have heard about the Committee on the Rights of the Child, and you certainly, I guess, presented reports to this committee or monitored the implementation of the convention with the experts on the rights of the child. To domesticate means to transform the objectives. The target 6.2 concerning the fight against violence against children at a national level, allowing to ground the measures in our program. It also means to provide detailed information with data about the situation of the child and the violence suffered. When we talk about the legal framework, when we want to adopt an approach based on rights, we need to have strategies based on the rights approach. And we need a change of paradigm, a change that must lead the states to respect and promote human dignity and the physical and psychological integrity of children as individuals, as persons bearer of rights, instead of considering them as victims. This is an aspect of the mandatory reading that you had to do. If you've done it, you must have noticed that this change of paradigm is essential when dealing with the rights-based approach. We also need systems and strategies for prevention and repression of violence based on an approach based on rights of the child instead of social protection. Social protection is great, but the rights approach allows to further ground to make a connection among the rights and everything concerning the person, to get out of the logic that consists in applying a right to a certain category of people. It's also an approach that allows to not do charity, but to carry out actions because it is an obligation. And the ultimate goal of this responsibility of the child, be that a victim or not, is to have sustainable solutions. As soon as the situation is known, some measures have to be taken to stop the violence and ensure that the child can gain access to appropriate services. What are the appropriate services? The possibility for the child, when he's a victim of violence, to signal, to report this violence. And this reporting can be done through helplines, permanent helplines. It can be done through listening services. It can be done through centers dedicated to this effect. It is important to underline that the listening of the child, when we speak of reporting, should not be in a disorderly fashion. There's a specific framework that needs to be observed, protocols to be respected. There's a format that needs to be observed, and we will come back to this, to these points. When we speak of the application, that is the concrete implementation of the rights approach, we must consider principles and actions. As far as principles, I'm sure you know, it's about the respect of the best interest of the child. When we speak about this, it's to ensure that all decisions regarding the child are focused on the child. That is, that the interest of the child is considered as paramount, as a priority. I refer you to the general observation of the committee, number 14, detailing specifically the elements of what we call the best interest of the child. As we speak of principles, it's about non-discrimination. Non-discrimination, the child has to be left aside. This is the objectives of the sustainable development. No children has to be left aside, whether the child lives in a village, in the mountains, in remote areas, or in far region. There's no reason on the part of the state to not provide appropriate services to this child, whatever his place of residence is, whether he belongs to a minority, whether he belongs to an indigenous population. There's no reason to not extend all the state services and the measures to all the children on the territory. After the best interest of the child, non-discrimination and participation. Participation is a key element. For instance, Article 12 in the Convention on the Rights of the Child speaks of the issue of participation as a center, although participation is not mentioned as such in the convention, but the objective interpretation of Article 12 in the convention provides a number of elements. It's about respecting the opinion of the child, of listening to his word, because the child is a subject of rights. He's an actor of his rights, and he has to be a protagonist. That means he must be part of the search for solution that concern him. And of course, the other principle is the right to live, to survive, and develop. In terms of actions, how can we convert these principles in actions. The rights approach demands for states to establish specific national programs destined to the fight against violence against children. It's an essential element. When the Rights Committee of the UN examines the periodic reports of the states, this is an essential element that is noted. In your countries, the state should have a national program specifically referred to fighting violence against children. This is an essential element. Without this program, it is difficult to measure and simply appreciate the different tools and measures adopted by the state to implement the obligations of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. As far as action, this rights approach also demands available and accessible services, also affordable. If we have a reporting system that we know, do we have a reporting system in the country? If there's a reporting system, is it known by children and by the educators that deal with the rights of the child in the country? If this reporting system exists, is it accessible for free and universally for all children? This is a fundamental question. For instance, if we cannot gain access to a telephone helpline, only for if we can only access to this for a certain time, and if this access is no longer available at night, for example, there's a problem, the access is no longer universal. Or if you have a category of cell phones that cannot gain access to the system, there's an issue, it is not accessible to all children. Or if the helpline is only available in the capital city or in large cities and not in villages or remote areas, there's a problem. So the rights approach demands that all these services must be extended to all the territory, including children in difficult areas. And this system should also be free of charge. For instance, if you have to pay to do this and you don't have the means to, you cannot gain access to justice. That is why the rights approach demands not only that the services are accessible, but also affordable, so that all the children can enjoy these services. We need adjusted practices, child-friendly practices. They have to be adapted to the children, and they have to be at the level of the children. That is, that the children can understand them, that children can exercise them. We need availability, but also accessibility, adjustability, universality, and they have to be understood. And all these elements together are elements that are demanded by the rights approach. If we have all these elements, we can say that we have a system that respects this approach based on rights, which should be the approach adopted by the state. So when I'm a victim as a child, I must gain access to justice and gain access to justice through legal medical certificates. For instance, I must have access to analysis, to justice. I must be the object of welcome. I have to be heard. My word need to be heard, and I must be able to restore my dignity as a child that is victim of violence. So how is the responsibility exercised? When we speak of the rights approach, it responds to elements that need to be holistic. We need a reporting system, and this reporting system must be specific and dedicated. State agents have to be dedicated to gather the words of the child or to enable this reporting. We need social workers who are dedicated and specifically formed for these objectives. Judges, so that judges must be installed to decide and evaluate the issues concerning violence against children. Beyond the reporting, we have a referral system orientation system, as it's called in French, that presupposes the capability of the state to propose. After the reporting, there has to be a therapeutic process proposed to respond to the needs of the child. We need to begin by listening to the child in a psychosocial accompaniment. The whole process begins with this psychological accompaniment. The listening must be performed by formed professionals, by trained professionals, based on a protocol and a favorable framework. If I take the Lazarus Convention, there's Article 35 that is specifically dedicated to the procedures to listen to the child, the interviews, how it must be done, what's the appropriate environment. For example, it has to be in a sober environment. The interview of the child must be recorded. We have to have the voice and the video, so we do not infinitely repeat this through all the players that need to listen to this case, so that he doesn't have to repeat the same thing. So we need to have a favorable environment, allowing to listen to the child in an objective manner, following a series of rules and protocols. And beyond this reporting and orientation mechanism and psychological listening, we need a therapeutic approach, allowing to consider the capability for resilience of the child. And this we'll see it later. We'll see a module about resilience specifically, so we will further detail what resilience is, taking into account the capability for resilience. The tutors, what is the resilience tutor? The treatment should also be adjusted to the child. When it comes to accompaniment and rehabilitation of the child, when we want to adopt a rights approach, it's about an approach that is global, holistic, that considers a certain number of elements as well as the legal aspect. It has been shown that when you legalize, when you put into the legal system these issues of violence, this includes rehabilitation, access to rights, and it facilitates, it's a catalyzer to ensure that the child can be restored as to his dignity. So the legal system allows us to preserve the rights of the child, to better orient the child and his family, because when a child is a victim of violence, all the services must be extended to the family. And this is also demanded by the rights approach. We should facilitate to go through the legal system, and there's a certain number of rights in the system, in the judicial system, that not everybody understands. So in order to navigate comfortably in this system, we need legal assistance. We must have access to some analysis that allow us to present some tangible evidence to the judge. And this legalization includes also the rehabilitation of the victim, the child victim. As we speak of rehabilitation, we can also refer to symbolic damages or monetary damages to put the child back on the way to a rehabilitation, to reestablish his dignity, to favor the physical, psychological, and spiritual development, and make him autonomous. All these elements are part of the rehabilitation and restoration of the child as to his dignity. How can we know what are the points of reference that allow us to say that this program is sufficiently oriented to the rights approach? For example, the program that is implemented, that is established, should begin with a precise starting point. We need a consultation of the players, including the children involved. The consultation is important because it allows to gather elements, indicators, information on which the program will be built. So there needs to be an analysis and a diagnosis of the situation. We need a situational analysis that will allow to evaluate, assess the problem, assess the causes of the problem, the consequences, before establishing, creating a proper program. This program has to be based on the guaranteed rights. The program must be articulated around the fundamental rights. This is of paramount importance, and his capacity for resilience. The program must be focused and adjusted to children. It has to be non-discriminatory and aiming at reducing inequalities and prioritizing the most marginalized children living in unprivileged areas or belonging to minorities or indigenous population. And these programs should also aim at eliminating obstacles to access to the rights of the child. For example, if I'm a victim of violence and I cannot find proper judges, if I was a victim of sexual abuse and I have no evidence, the guilt of the presumed perpetrator cannot be proved. So the system, a system based on the rights approach, has to be able to offer a number of disposition, a mechanism that allows me to make the necessary analysis, medical or legal, that allow me to prove to the judge that I was a victim of this violence. When we speak of the rights approach, the program is as important as the implementation means. The process has to be articulated around strategies, methods, and practices that consider and aim at the autonomy of the child, his development, and his role in society. The Convention of the Rights of the Child speaks of the rehabilitation of the child so he can play a constructive role in society. A child victim of violence should be able to lift himself up again. The child who's a victim of violence should benefit from the services that allow him to become autonomous, independent. Therefore, to reach this level, we need some sort of local appropriation. This is important when it comes to local government. What do we do, for example, at the city level, in the neighborhoods? What are the measures established by the centralized collectivities? What are the services implemented by the city, the neighborhoods, to respond to these needs, to respond to these requirements? So you need a local level and the responsibility of the authorities. The state should be able to make decisions. If the state makes decisions and the capital city and the decentralized areas, the cities and the districts are not contacted or involved in this decision-making process, it doesn't work. So this requires a participation of children as protagonists. Protagonist means that the child is a part of the entire process, and it is a means and also an objective. Participation must ensure that the objectives can contain elements that stem from a situational analysis, including the children. The authors, the players have to be involved and trained. And when we speak of training, it's not just initial training, but also continuous, permanent training. We can have, for example, in faculties of legal faculties or psychology, or we can have this knowledge. But if we have no access to training that will allow us to update our knowledge and adjust our tools to the reality, it is not applicable. And the rights approach demands for training to be part of the methods implemented by the state. So the tools have to be adjusted to the children. We need monitoring and internal and external evaluation, not just by the part of organization, but also the state services, and also the part of the collaborators that are involved in the program. You need transparency, a transparency that must be part of all the data that are collected. In summary, I'd like to focus my summary on 3 axes. First, the program based on a rights approach. The programs should be based on the fundamental rights of the child. This is of paramount importance. If it's not based on the essential rights of the child, we're starting on a bad basis. The human rights norm, and particularly for children, must provide a framework for the establishment of objections, targets, and indicators that can be measured. This is very important. This is a major foundation. We also need an analysis of the causes, and the analysis of the causes must aim at the apparent causes, the underlying causes, deep causes, and identified and are and analyzed. This is a valid solution, has to provide a valid solution in a given country and not necessarily in another. So we need to adjust. We need to adjust to the situation. When we speak of the training of when we speak of developing indicators, these are established based on a study that allows to see whether the physical and emotional development of the children, how are the social workers, how are the psychologists. There has to be in the accompaniment of the child, the psychological accompaniment in the study. The studies must also allow to study the problems affecting the children. We need the pedagogy of early childhood. All these are resources that allow us to ground these programs at the grassroots level. So as part of this analysis, the analysis has to include all the involved parties and be based on the capability of the state to implement these programs for the benefit of the children, and has to work with all the actors, specifically the civil society organization. When it comes to the beneficiaries, they must be considered as subjects of rights. They are major actors, major players in their development. They must not be seen as simple beneficiaries or just people who consume a service that is offered. Participation, once again, is an objective and a means, and the children have to be considered as protagonists, and this is a need in this approach. As far as objectives, when we speak of ultimate objectives, the program targets as a priority the marginalized groups. We should ensure that the dedicated services for the marginalized allow them to get out of the situation in which they are and no longer suffer violence. The strategies should favor the autonomy and responsibility. The development process must be at the local level. The program should aim at reducing inequalities. And to conclude, the process is the result of the implementation of the program, must be monitored, evaluated. The national system for responsibility must be reinforced to ensure that the performance of the governments is evaluated and that nobody feels left out. All the people who suffered violations must gain access to recourses and resources with the authorities and mechanisms. And then lastly, we should establish partnerships to ground the solutions at the local level. So I suggested some mandatory reading. I'm convinced you all read the observation at number 13, and I thank you very much. I'm available for your questions. We're going to ask questions slowly. We have time for questions. Please allow some time for the interpreters to translate these questions in different languages. Yeah, I was going to reply to the 4 questions that were already in the chat box. I see see there's a problem as far as the translation. Are the two interpreters back? Yes, Lilivia, is there? Great. Thank you so much, Marie-Laure. There's a number of questions raised by participants. The first one is to know whether the existence of specific programs by itself is sufficient as an action at this level. When talking of the rights approach, the existence of programs is important. It is a starting point that defines the state strategies. Initially, there's an existing legal framework. There's also a program based on the legal framework, and then we must go beyond what specifically refers to programs. The program should be able to establish services, preferably decentralized services, services that are implemented by trained people, by dedicated people, services that can reach all the children in the state. These services should be adjusted, should be accessible, and affordable. So the program on itself is not sufficient. Why? Because in a number of states we have programs, but there are no funds, resources to gain access to the program. In this case, we cannot speak of a rights-based approach, or at least it's limited, since the necessary resources for the translation of this program and to enact it is not possible. So this program will not respond to the rights approach. This is an essential element we need to raise when we do monitoring or evaluation, by underlining that on one hand, we have the program, which is great, but we must have the necessary means so that the program can be grounded at the national level, and the different services are actually implemented and accessible, affordable, and available for all the children. This was the first question. Secondly, the symbolic or monetary damage, is it adjusted to violence against children? When I was presenting, I spoke about a number of reparation that is possible. Of course, we cannot stop at monetary damages or symbolic damage. When children are victims of violence, we have to go beyond this symbolic reparation. Just the fact that the presumed perpetrator recognizes the fact, acknowledges it's already symbolic, and it allows the child to reconstruct himself. When there's a crime on the part of the perpetrator, this worsens. When there's a denial on the part of the perpetrator, this worsens the damages. So symbolic reparation is not neglected, but we cannot stop at that. The rights approach goes beyond. It offers monetary damages, a reparation that goes all the way to the rehabilitation of the child as far as his rights and dignity, reparation that will allow the child to bounce back and take up a constructive role in society, as the Convention on the Rights of the Child indicates. There's another issue. There's another question by Aimé Adi. He asks, can we say that the rights approach discourages the removal from justice? On the contrary, it doesn't discourage this. I mentioned some elements, and I said that the rights approach gathers elements to ensure that the practices, services, and what is suggested to the child can have a holistic character. So it firstly includes the possibility to report the violence, the possibility to be heard, to be referred, oriented to adjusted systems for accompaniment and responsibility, and attentive listening that happens in a favorable framework carried out by people, social workers, psychologists, trained doctors in a favorable environment. We need reporting, psychology, orientation, therapeutic, but also the law. It is was proven that when you go all the way to justice and a decision sanctions the issue, this accelerates or at least allows a rehabilitation that is a quicker rehabilitation, of more favorable rehabilitation. Then there's a question in Spanish. I understand that the rights approach should be a priority and not the social approach. Could you give me more information about this approach or about the different approaches? When we speak on an approach based on needs or based on the social protection, we say that at a given place, there's a need that needs to be satisfied. In a given region, in a given district, there's a need because the children in this region have no access to a certain number of services. But the problem is that when we limit these services to the specific needs with regard to children, we forget an essential element that demanded by the legal approach. It requires non-discrimination. It requires coverage to give priority to the children who are marginalized, excluded, with no access to services as other children. It's an essential difference between the two approaches. The rights approach is based on all the services inherent to the people and not services that are necessary, but services that have to be available and adjusted to all the children in the entire national territory. As soon as we have an approach based on needs, the state could limit its service to the need that was identified at a given time. And then when this is exhausted, we no longer need to intervene. That's why at the level of humanitarian help or action, there's increasingly an approach that is based on rights. For example, we no longer take corn or beans from the United States for children who are at the bottom of Buenos Aires. But when there's a humanitarian need in the region, we have to gain access to services that are already available, which allows to be grounded at the regional level and appropriation of all the services by local population, and also ensure that these are not just actions that are inherited, but that are agreed at the national level. So there's a fundamental difference between the two approaches. Another question, the rights approach can truly overcome the one based on needs. There are several mechanisms that have to be established for their implementation. Do we have the human or material means to respond to all these needs? These requirements deriving from the rights approach are, first of all, needs that the state must respect. The state has committed at the international regional level to ensure these services for children, whether they are victims or not. This is a commitment of the state, and it is based on this commitment that the state must articulate and offer a number of services or respond to these obligations contracted when they ratify mechanisms at the regional or international level. All the states ratified the Convention of the Rights of the Child, which presupposes that in order to comply with the dispositions that they consented to, they must implement a number of services. It is not too much to ask the state to establish national programs. Not only that, but they have to provide the necessary means so that this program can be adjusted to the realities on the ground. Then you must allocate the necessary resources so that this program can truly be executed. You can ensure that the people implementing this program have been appropriately trained so that the service is given in optimal conditions. So it is not too much to ask from the state to establish programs. And before implementing programs, they must study, see whether the identified program had some solutions and what effect the measures provided or offered. If the measures had limited effects, how can we go beyond the measures that were already implemented to ensure that the program can attain objectives based on the responsibility of the state that consists in offering services, programs to all the children, and so that no child is left aside, is left behind, so that no child is a victim of violence. Or if these children are victims of violence, they should gain access to justice. There's a question that says the rights approach is the most complete for our actions, where the obligation of the state is central. My question is, how can we influence the conformity of the states who do not have political will and who do not consider the child as a priority? Great question. Does this mean that on the one hand, we can ratify a convention that necessarily imposes obligations and not respect these because we do not have the political will? This is a question that I share with you. I don't have the answer, but the international right demands that once the state takes commitments and ratifies a treaty, convention, or protocol, it should establish at the national level, it should take all the necessary measures, whether these are laws, programs, rules, to enforce the contracted obligations. And I can assure you that it is not too much to ask a state to do this. If there's no political will, and unfortunately, we've seen that in many states, this political will is missing because we consider that there are other priorities and that the child is not part of these. It is because of this that to not leave this convention on the rights of the child as a convention with no mechanisms that allows it to monitor the national application. The convention has established a committee, just as the Convention of Lanzarote, that established a secretariat for the follow-up and implementation of the convention. It's the same at the level of the state. There is a commission that allows to appreciate, evaluate the measures implemented by the state at the national level. I think that we should say something that sometimes cannot be easy, but that needs to be done. As long as a state has made a commitment, these engagements must be honored. Luckily, we have a mechanism to pressure the states, although unfortunately at the international level, there's no sanction system as such that allows to, for example, imprison the state or sanction the state because of a lack of measures. But it's precisely the reason why we have this committee. That is why even at the national level, we have systems that allow us to hold the state responsible. For example, if we notice that there's a lot of violence against children in the school system, the state should be able to take necessary measures. If there's violence at the family level, the state should be able to establish a system that allows to remove the child from a violent environment. We know that in sports, the children are increasingly victims of violence. The state should follow up on these sports centers to ensure that the children are not victims of violence. And the perpetrator should be able to respond to his actions and to justice and rehabilitate the child, whether the child is a priority or not. We can see that based on the universal ratification, there's an engagement on the part of the state. We can consider that the states have the will to respect the rights of the child. And I think that we must pressure the state so that there are programs and strategies at the national level. We're going to go to the questions that are written in the chat, but we're going to at the same time give the floor. So Blanca Estela asked a question. If she can ask it, Blanca Estela. And then we'll have Emilienne. Is Blanca Estela still there? I'm here. The question is about, we are directly involved in communities where the rights approach still needs to be worked at the level of thought, attitude, and behavior. Since these are very precarious and impoverished and excluded communities, they're very much involved with a needs approach. I think there's a great challenge in processes of formation and transformation to take up this approach for the defense of children. But my question is, Yao, how can we involve the communities based on this approach committed to the defense of the rights of children, as we see that precisely these rights have been violated and not complied with? Thank you. Should you translate or should I respond based on what I understood? We did not hear you, Yao. I did not hear the translation. Oh. Yes, I heard the translation. You should select French, Yao, in interpretation. Well, can she ask the question again, just the last part of the question, by specifying the country, the association, and your video, please? Blanca Fuentes from Guatemala Foundation, Pedro Poveda. My question is, how can we involve communities in the defense of the rights of children, having taken up this rights approach? The state, the responsibility of the state is very clear, but when the non-compliance on the part of the states is evident, how can communities be empowered to make this viable as far as what they are responsible for? The rights approach is an approach that starts from the base. Without the participation of the community, it's difficult to truly speak of an approach based on rights. That is why there's an essential element, that is the right to information. Communities should be informed about the implementation of the programs. The state should be able to spread information at the heart of communities, and through consultations, ask communities to provide an analysis of or make propositions about the subject, the topic that affects them. Without the participation of communities, a solution that is decided in the capital that we just applied to the communities at the basis would not make sense, could not bring the necessary effects if we're not in a rights-based approach. So how must we ensure that this information is provided at the community level, at the grassroots level? We precisely need a decentralized organization. I was talking about city halls. I was talking about the action in neighborhoods and local organizations, everything that we can do at the local level. We know, for example, if we at the national level, and sometimes national consultations or local community consultations are done as a facade, superficially. The state should not come and say, we're going to establish this program. What do you propose? No, you need to explain the objective of this process, what solution we want to reach, what are the indicators we are establishing, and it is precisely through the information gathered through propositions made by local propositions that you define indicators. It is based on this information that the program is put together, and it is based on these indicators that we can truly establish solutions that respond to the needs at the grassroots level. That is why, if this is not done, and I can assure you that at the international regional level, participation has become an essential given. A state that did not consult its grassroots level will be discredited international. We consider such a state like a state that who does not respect its population. I can assure you that at the international level, it is not well considered. That is what all the states rely on these consultations, sometimes just superficially, just to say that they have done it, although it wasn't done deeply or truly giving the floor to the people who are involved or affected, people who are capable of saying, with regard to the situation, these are the possible solutions. There was also a question in that along that line about the communities of leaders of Govodi. Edouard, was Yao's response sufficient? Or Edouard and Benet, since we are talking about the place of the community and the leaders, we can continue, and I will not forget Angelica later, especially for Edouard, who raised the question about the children who live in villages. So this comes back to the concern of Yao. In fact, at the level of our countries or in RDC, we have great texts, some laws and programs. So as we read, we could hope that the situation of children can truly find solutions. But what is more difficult at community levels? So there's a commitment at the level of communities. I'm going to speak, for example, about the DRC. There's a program, but what raises issues is the measures for accompaniment. So I appreciated Yao's presentation. I understand this as a system. As soon as there's one part that doesn't work, the whole thing will not work. So we have the case of children who are identified situations of vulnerability. We we involve the grassroots level, but there's an issue of the services that raises issues. So at some point, we have to see that we have to support the children government programs, the contribution of government. I want to talk about the aspect about recession or action. Everything that has to do with corruption and phenomena and impunity, all of this is discouraging. So there are people who prefer to make arrangements, friendly arrangements to the detriment of victim, but instead of going against justice. What I understand, everything that Yao presented, we understand we need services, we need laws, we need to enforce them, but in our context, we have to understand this as a system. If one part is not involved, if the community is not involved, this raises issues. I don't know whether my colleague can say something. Perhaps we're going to listen to two questions at once, and Yao will respond. The floor goes to Angelica, and then Gaston. Gaston, you can get ready. Thank you. I'm from the pastoral office for family and children in Colombia. I'd like to share a reflection. I found this presentation very interesting, but I'd like to further explore another concept, a sociological concept, that is the structural violence. All the elements you discussed are essential in this approach. However, I was surprised by the fact that no sanction is anticipated for the states that do not respect their commitments. And we can speak of invisible violence, and this has repercussions on the quality of life. So what can we do to ensure that these reports that are presented every 5 years about the rights of the child in accordance with the convention, what can we do with regard to recommendations? What can we do to ensure that these recommendations are then also translated or present in the decisions of the state, for example? If the life of people is in danger because of different types of conflicts, what's the concept of development that we can adopt? What's the rights-based approach? It won't find its place in such situations. What's the political action we can have to ensure that the child is a reality and that the state takes into account this situation and adopts an ethical and responsible behavior? Last question by Gaston, and Danielle will respond, and then we'll go to another question. You want to introduce yourself as well as your country? My name is Gaston, in the province in Chad. I'd like to speak about a point that was mentioned during the presentation, because we have a concern here. The legal matter in our constitution, the second to last constitution, provided for something we call dia. So when some perpetrators of a crime act, when they have a lot of money, they will go to the parents and fix it by giving money. But from a legal standpoint, they are not taken up. In this presentation of a constitutional law? Do we see an encouragement to a crime? Because although we've said that there's monetary damages, this is a point. So our states would take care of these marginalized children. Should we not include in our constitutions sanctions against these people who affect the integrity of these children? I would also go back to a point about the service in our country. All these services that Yao mentioned, we found them very far. It's usually in large cities, but in small cities, there's no decentralization of services. So on a community plan, how can we, there's the aspect of the education of population in our villages. There's tradition that still reigns. The tradition rules everyday life. Even the law of the state does not overcome tradition. How can we relate tradition and law so we can find a way to protect the children? Thank you. Thank you for this question from RDC Colombia, Chad. I will begin with DRC. What you say is true, in fact, and this translates all the challenges we have at the national level. How do states ensure that people can actually enjoy their rights? Unfortunately, we can and we must note that the accompaniment measures for accompaniment are quite scarce. There are elements that we can analyze. For instance, when the state adopts its national budget, the annual budget must provide for services, be that a national, provincial, district, or a city budget. We have to include some lines that are destined to implement and strengthen a number of services for children, helplines, psychological, legal analysis, a number of services allowing the population to gain access to justice. Unfortunately, we see that these services do not exist. And what I would suggest, for example, when we see that there is a lack of on the part of the state, we can tell the state, if you don't have the capability, you can ensure that there are subventions, subsidies active on these topics so that some services can be given. If the state cannot ensure this, there should be some subsidies that already exist. For instance, when these subsidized centers only respond to 10-year-old children, the state can say you have to respond to children up to the age of 14, and you'll have this subsidy to respond to the needs of these children. The state must find a number of solutions to a lack of resources. Of course, the state will never have sufficient resources for all the needs, but it is its responsibility to organize itself. Organization already allows to ensure services to be available. For example, the helplines. Helplines are fine. It allows to report a fact. But if the reporting can also only be done in the capital, as we said, if we have reporting possibilities only in the capital city, and in village people cannot gain access to these services, we're not in a rights-based approach. When we receive, for example, the call, we must orient the child to centers that are available and that can offer this care. The state must organize itself and identify the social services throughout the territory, and a given call must be responded and referred to an appropriate person. So you need partnerships as possible solutions. You can have a more appropriate organization to ensure that the lack of resources is not a problem or an obstacle for access to services and justice. The question about friendly arrangements, this is something that affects the rights of the victim. If you make an arrangement, if you settle, that means that you do not recognize the child victim as a victim. And this is very dangerous, because right now the presumed perpetrator recognizes as it goes to settle, because this encourages impunity, and impunity ensures that violent acts against children will be repeated in time. So the solutions that go around the settlement encourage impunity, because the perpetrator knows that by offering resources, by having resources, every time he knows that every time he will commit a violent act against the children, he can negotiate and give some money to the family or the child. And this is contrary to access to justice. About the question from Colombia, unfortunately, there are no sanctions at the international level, but there's one thing that every 5 years we examine the reports of the state, and the Committee on the Rights of the Child says that Colombia doesn't do this. Colombia has not established necessary measures to implement things that were formulated 5 years ago. The state is therefore forced to implement the measures that are imposed. The example of Colombia, the Colombian Institute of Bienes Familiares, it's the national organization that supervises the implementation of programs for the rights of the child, should have appropriate resources so that children can gain access to justice. For example, with regard to the COVID-19 pandemic, this organization implemented programs to respond to the increase of violence against children, specifically within the family. But the question is, do they have the necessary resources to respond to all the children, or is it just for children who are in Medellin or Bogota? Is it only them who can gain access to these services? The indigenous children, do they participate or equally benefit from this? Unfortunately not. That is why the committee is open to listen to all the concerns coming from the grassroots level, and then formulate recommendations that are appropriate and that pressure the state precisely to repair or establish services that are necessary. With regard to the question, it's true that if the state must act, these are invisible, this is invisible violence. But I think that as a civil society organization, we should place the state in the face of its responsibility that can show us through our reports, activities, conversations, the gaps in the system, the gaps. We can turn to the state be that based on the Human Rights Convention or at regional instances, we can always call up to the state and obtain some approaches, solutions, or measures that can improve the situation. About the question from Chad that refers to the issue about communities, a settlement is a violation of the dignity of the victim. Although there are no international sanctions, there are sanctions that are provided for at the state level. So violence against children is punished. If violence is not punishable based on the criminal code, we must act so that the law takes into account domestic violence, because children suffer domestic violence. They suffer violence at school. They suffer violence in the community. But does the criminal code or national law take into account these different categories of violence suffered by children in different environments? If that is not the case, you have to ensure that the law is reviewed or reformed. In terms of prevention, there is a lot to be done. Unfortunately, states are more in the repression side or healing rather than prevention. We are more led to healing, which means that we have less services that deal with prevention. For instance, the fact of keeping children in school, the fact of ensuring that children go to school, that primary school is mandatory. All of this is a system that allows us to maintain children in school and remove them from the streets, or remove them from the exploitation or the violence they could suffer in the streets, or groups that they should not be socializing with. For example, the parent schools. In some countries, there are parent schools. These are structures that allow parents to speak, to share practices, to listen to what is being done, and the best practices that can inspire solutions for children. If we can organize these sorts of structures, this allows us to avoid problems, because in exchanges and conversations, we can find a number of solutions at a family level to ensure that the prevention can prevent children to suffer violence, including in the family. Thank you. So we're now going to give the floor for some brief questions. We have 20 minutes left. So as part of the discussions, there was Emilienne, Thomas, Rose, who still had questions. So I ask you to introduce yourselves, to ask short questions, and we also need brief responses to get to the end of the session. Thank you, Marie-Laure. Good morning. I'm Emilienne. I work for children in the Ivory Coast. So excuse my voice. I want to know about the reservation. Thank you for this brilliant presentation. I have a concern. In our country, in our states, they ratify without reservation. So they cannot apply the dispositions in the different conventions, but the fact that I ratify with no reservation, what does that expose me to? And how long do we need to alleviate these reservations? Thank you. Thomas, we had a question. Yes, thank you, Marilo. My question is about where do you come from? I come from the program for steward children. the east of in Bukavu. My question is in that same direction, and this along the same line of Emilien's about the constraint mechanisms, the measures to force the states to respect their engagements. I think that Yao had clarified this, so I will not come back to this question. Thank you. Rose. Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I have a concern. I did not, your country. I come from Burkina Faso. I'm director of the primary school. Thank you. I have a concern. I did not hear about the duties of the child. During the entire presentation, I did not hear about the duties. Why did he not speak about the duties? Because as you teach the rights to children, should you not also teach the duties? All right, we're going to conclude well for the last question. With regard to the reservations, this is a very complicated technical legal question. There's a difference between a state that ratified with reserve and a difference and the state that ratified without reservation. When you ratify with reservation, it means that you veto the dispositions that were reserved, which means that if the reservation is based on the marriage of children, it means that the state is not forced to apply this disposition that commits it to remove, to eradicate, to early forced marriages. At the international level, it is quite a complicated issue because states estimate that in the name of sovereignty, it can ratify conventions with regard to dispositions, but there's what we call the object and the objective of the treaty. Can a reservation deal with the objective of the treaty? For example, by ratifying the Convention on the Rights of the Child, if a state issues a reservation on the disposition that demands the state to present periodic reports to the committee, can we consider this reservation as an attempt to the objective of the issue itself? This is an issue that is at the international level, but it is clear that preventing a mechanism to review is not in conformity with the objective and aim of the convention. So this reservation somehow kills the convention and puts some suspicion on the actual intention of the state by ratifying the convention. If you ratify your convention and if you forbid the committee to rely on its mandate, you are ratifying, you are not giving with your left hand what you're removing with your right hand. Reservations are mechanisms that somehow kill the state's commitment, allowing them to not respect what's been provided for in the convention. With regard to the international level, we can intervene at any time. The state can decide to say what reservations when the international law is not in conformity. Now that we have reformed the international law and we are in conformity with the convention, we can withdraw the reservation. But as a civil society organization, when we work with states, we must also underline the importance of withdrawing the reservations by mentioning, for example, the fact that reservations formulated years ago no longer are enforceable today because either the state has evolved or it is the object of the reservation is no longer an issue. With regard to Thomas's question, with regard to the convention, there's a system of evaluation and monitoring done by the committee, but beyond this, the state make commitments. For example, the Sustainable Development Objectives. This is a program commitment that defines certain pillars that the state must implement. For example, 6.2 that requires states to eradicate violence against children by 2030. This is a commitment that the states have made. And there's a mechanism allowing the states, be that at the Human Rights Council or the UPR, but there's also a more political, the high-level political forum that is being held in the United States, allowing states to report the national measures adopted to implement their commitments. There are also other partnerships, for instance, the World Partnership to eliminate violence against children, and such a number of countries represented here are pioneer countries that are called to implement a number of measures to eradicate violence against children on the territory. With regard to the last question by Madam Rose from Burkina, the duties of the child, this is a technical question as well. I must say that be that at the level of Latin America, Europe, or Asia, there are no dispositions that mention the issue of rights. In the charter in Africa, we have some dispositions referring to the duties of the child, the duty of the child to respect his parents, to not betray his country, to respect the emblems, everything concerning his country. But I must underline a fundamental issue. Having duties is not a bad thing. Respecting one's parents, I think it's automatic. It's part of ethics and the order we need in society and the family. But we need to say that the enjoyment on the part of a child is not subject to the execution of the rights, and it's not because the child did not obey his parents that he must not be admitted to school. And I think that it is very important to insist on this. By the fact of saying that the child does not respect his duty, then he cannot enjoy his rights. No, but in itself, speaking of rights of the child, is not bad in itself. We simply must not subject the enjoyment of the rights to the compliance with the duties.